Let's get right to it, because I was given by Jack what turned out to be an enormously complex subject. This is one of the most complex papers I've ever encountered. I didn't expect it to be either. I was caught by surprise. And so what you're going to get is the beginnings of my reflection on the idea that we can learn something about councils, come to understand councils through the medium of iconography, which, as always in Orthodoxy, is our greatest teacher, right? Working, of course, in a perfect hermeneutic circle with the liturgy and doctrine, right? We can't learn without iconography. I did expect, though, the iconographic part of the study to be relatively straightforward. When I went into this, I thought, okay, this is one of the simpler and, in fact, more boring iconographic subjects, and besides, it's all been done. It was Christopher Walter's doctoral dissertation in 1970, done under Grabar. Well, it turns out there's a real reason why a published doctoral dissertation has to be 370 pages long. And Walter missed a lot. And the subject is iconologically much more subtle, much more intellectual and developed and thoughtful than I expected it to be. So what you're going to see today is just the tip of the iceberg. No more. Now, this is an outline of what we're going to say. And I would like to go very rapidly through the first 4 points, because I think the interesting thing is the fifth. And since this comes last in our conference, and since it's really about, okay, what are we going to do with all this? What does all this have to do with how we're going to understand our life in church? I thought we should spend the most time talking about that. It also introduces methodological questions which have a direct connection to things practically every other speaker has said, particularly Father Taft and Sister Vasa. I'll bring them up in due time. However, the first one is necessary. Next, please. Simply because on the first day you were asked how many of you had been here before, and only about half raised their hands. And so for the benefit of people who haven't encountered our discussions of this before, this is Iconology 101. I have to do this because I have to be able to use this terminology while we're looking at the council pictures. But I assure you, this is Iconology 101 done in about 5 minutes. So good luck to us. The essential point to understand is that iconology, that is the reading of iconography in a way that is meaningful, in a way that is didactic, is an exegetical or hermeneutic activity. It's an activity of reading and thinking. It is most definitely not a mystical activity. And I never, you heard about that from Father Taft in our panel discussion, and I never use the word spiritual in the abstract sense of an abstract spirituality, right? Texts are read in the Orthodox manner when we read with the Holy Spirit. It seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us, say the Council Fathers. What are the elements of this kind of reading, of this language? And you see, you see there, first of all, as with any text, one goes for its fundamental structures. And one of the principles of iconography, of Orthodox iconography, is that there is always an underlying order, right? The framework on which the icon, no matter how it looks, is constructed, has an underlying order. What we are looking at is not people as such, but figures, and I can't at this point go into a long discourse on what that means. I gave a whole lecture on it here once. But it basically, think of it as scheme. The word relates to the idea of schema or morphe, not just in the literal sense, but also in the generalized sense. And that's very important because if that's so, it means that one scheme for one subject matter can be passed on to another subject matter, and that's exactly what happened with councils. You can take the same formal scheme and present a new subject matter with it. And then third is a fundamental distinction, probably best shown with the next slide, between two ways of representing figures. One can show them hieratically, that is, in their most formal sense, absolutely as symmetrical as possible, and with an absence of motion, or if there is motion in a single figure in the composition as a whole, that motion will be balanced out by position so that there's symmetrical stillness and order in the whole, right? And that versus what's called a narrative approach, which is mimetic. It's like a snapshot. It's like catching people in action. And you can see that quite clearly in these two representations, where this representation shows the apostles and the Mother of God in very hieratic ways, while we have an absolutely hieratic presentation of the ascension of Christ supported by angels. But this one is hieratic in its upper zone, even though these angels are swooping in quite dramatically. You can see that as a pair, the order of that part of the icon is extremely hieratic. Tip number one, never shoot a laser pointer in your eye. Whereas the historical range, the earthly range, the range in which life is going on, is here presented extremely narratively, so much so that even the central figure, the Mother of God, is turned so that you're seeing her in profile, and she's making a gesture to one side. So it's that moment of action. Nevertheless, the underlying ordo or taxis is quite clear. There's a central axis right here, and Christ and the Mother of God are placed on it, and that's a very typical basic form for composition. A central, most significant subject with balancing flankers. That's the implied order. While we're looking at these, I'll anticipate the next slide. You also see these are called registers. This would be the upper register, the lower register. In any Byzantine iconography, and even actually in almost all Orthodox iconography, even the most modern and quote-unquote realist, you'll see this basic framework of a central axis of symmetry and somewhere a horizontal axis, and that's going to divide the image into registers, and so those registers can become zones of meaning. When we say zone, we're talking about the meaning of position. So in this case, heaven and earth, for example. Same composition there. So clearly these two are closely related in a recension. There's a family relationship between them. Figura. The next slide, just going through some more of our key words, and I'll illustrate figura best with the next slide, but let's look at these key words. In Orthodox iconography, the meaning is never just what's out on the surface, right? There is always a deeper, more underlying meaning. It's like Scripture itself, right? So that sometimes the plain meaning of Scripture looks evident, but if one puts it in relationship to Scripture as a whole, the meaning becomes much richer and more complex, and often there's a much deeper meaning. That's what's called a text-gloss relationship. Attributes are characteristic elements of figures so that we know who and what they are. Attributes can be very specific to a single person, a single individual. No one but Peter carries keys. Or they can be generic attributes like wearing a crown. All of this we're going to see in the council images. Right? And any king would be identified as king by wearing a crown. We've already discussed zone and recension, so let's go to the next slide. And you can see here a deeper meaning of recension. The first one looked like a self-evident recension. They come from the same family and they're very clearly disposed the same way. But here, you have to be exegetical. You have to think to realize that the figure of Christ Pantocrator is being used as the figure to present St. Nicholas. And in fact, this is quite common for bishops, and this is going to be very, very important in the council images. But it has a theological meaning. It means that bishops present Christ. So they are represented as Christ. Same gestures, same attributes, right? Except, of course, for the unique attribute of Christ that his halo always has a cross in it. Text and gloss. Nicholas Hieratic is the central theme of this icon. He is the essence of the icon. The absolute, if you want to put it that way. But this is what's called a life icon or a vita icon. And so we have Nicholas' narrative. So we have Nicholas both in his hieratically absolute presentation, but also we know of his sanctity through his life history. So there's a text gloss, and notice the zones. Center, margins. So the zones are being used to create a hierarchy of meaning. Nevertheless, we know that this is Nicholas because of the figura that is appropriate to Nicholas. There's something called physiognomy, which is basically how you recognize your spouse or your monastic brother or somebody when you meet them in a somber place. You can kind of spot the elements and say, I know who that is, right? And then you know whether to kick in the fight reaction or the flight reaction. Next, please. All right, so point 2. All right. There are lots and lots and lots of pictures of councils, of images of councils. They have basic iconological or iconographic elements, but there's a lot of freedom and variation. You mustn't think of iconography as sort of rigid copying, and there's one model, and if you don't follow that one model, you've somehow violated some kind of canon. As you see, I'm basically saying all the same things Sister Vasa said this morning, which is why I think we could have canceled this and just gone off. For example, in a picture of a council, you'll see always a kind of central ruler, somebody who's the central authority. In an image of council, you'll see synaxis. You can't have a council with one person. It's always a group image. In a picture of council, right, you will see a hierarchy of truth. There are winners and losers in pictures of councils. And so the disposition, the physical disposition, will be hierarchical. And you'll see this quite clearly. Zones are used for this purpose. You will see the attributes of authority. You can't have a council unless it's authoritative. So attributes of authority are present. Those are some of the basic elements. When I started to look for principles of arrangement and design, in the naive beginnings of creating this paper, I thought, no problem. All icons are going to be basically, all council icons are going to be basically symmetrical. In fact, they're going to be boringly symmetrical. And no, that's the way. Well, it turns out it's not quite the case. That in fact, the inclusion of councils in iconographic programs is very purposeful, very deliberate. It's not just, oh yeah, there were 7 councils, we got to have them in there. They're positioned and placed for specific reasons, and how they are depicted varies a lot from one to another, so that there's a great deal going on in them. So there's no general remark one can say. There aren't any specific principles of arrangement of a council icon that are any different from the universal principles of iconology that I've just introduced you to. Same principles, that's all. For the rest, there is iconographic freedom, which there always is. Creativity, innovation, originality, design, thinking, theology. All of that's in every icon, except the kind of cookie cutter icons that we have today produced by machines. Sorry, Jack. Produced by machines and handed out by bishops by the hundreds every time they show up, usually on little thin pieces of paper. It's a serious pastoral iconological problem, what one is to do with these things. Right? Much more serious problem, however, is that they have led to an attitude among iconographers that if they do not follow, almost in the sense of copy, the great examples, their icon won't somehow be true. And this is very inimical to thinking. Where do you find these? Now, next slide, please. I'll just make a list of where you find council iconography. It's in all kinds of media. You find it in books. You find it in mural paintings, on walls. You find it, surprisingly, very rarely on panel portable icons. Very rare. Why is that a surprise? Because the commemoration of the councils, of each council, is in the liturgical calendar. And you'd expect, therefore, to be proskenarian icons, lots of them readily available for those celebrations. Not so, they're quite rare. In books, you find it in various kinds of books, lectionaries, hagiography, homiliaries, menologia. Nevertheless, there is a serious clustering. If I went through Walter's list, which I repeat is incomplete and still takes 300 pages to get through, and if you look at Walter's list, overwhelmingly the preponderance are found in two kinds of resources. One is the liturgical collection of the homilies of Gregory of Nazianzus, and the other is mural painting from the 14th century to the 16th century, or just into the 17th century. So if one did a kind of statistical graph, you'd see two big humps in those reference to those two media, and they're also chronological humps. The Gregory of Nazianzus hump runs, roughly speaking, from the 11th to the 14th century. The mural painting, as I already said, runs roughly from the 14th century to the early 17th century. And the other interesting thing is that it's very geographically limited. Overwhelmingly, it's in the Balkans. Overwhelmingly, it's in the Balkans. All of that's going to have meaning. We'll talk about it in part 5. But we've been talking throughout the conference about the relationship between doctrine, dogma, theology, culture. And obviously, this implies a cultural phenomenon. Right? Here in this example, we notice also that the Balkan mural paintings tend to include the full series of councils. So when you get one council in a Balkan painting, you're going to get them all in a wall painting, by and large. I'll show some exceptions later. And we'll be coming back to each of these images a little bit later to talk about specific elements of this one. This is just to illustrate position and place. Notice that it's in the narthex. That's the characteristic place for it. Right? Notice that it is high up. Next, please. In fact, sometimes so high, it's over your head. And one more interesting feature of this particular one is that it combines ecumenical councils and local councils, and thereon hangs a tale, I believe. What's the relationship between the two, right? The local councils in this case are local councils of the region, local councils of self-assertion, of church governance and authority. Next, please. All right. Now, we all know that there's a relationship in this direction between councils and iconography. We all know that because we all know about the iconoclast controversy and the Council of Nicaea too. And so we're well aware of the fact that councils have said things about iconography. However, Father Taft made outstanding reference to this during the first panel discussion. We are often bamboozled into thinking that because councils have made pronouncements about icons, they have made pronouncements about iconography, when in fact it is, by and large, Russians and a few Greeks, modern ones, who are making these pronouncements about iconography. The number of canons, I'm using canons in Sister Vasa's sense, about iconography, I haven't actually sat down and tried to make the total list. I kind of stand in awe of Sister Vasa's erudition, or Father Taft's computer and his manuscripts, but I've come close, and I think you can count it easily on two hands, the number of canons about iconography. What's more, as Sister Vasa made so clear this morning, nobody cares about those canons. They are completely ignored. They are ignored from the moment they are pronounced. Right? I'll show you this a little later in the paper. And they absolutely say nothing at all about style. There is not a single canonical statement anywhere in the conciliar literature about iconographic style. There are some occasional remarks about doing it the good old traditional way in some Russian councils. Nobody says what that way is. Even Nicaea II took a while to get established from an iconographic point of view, to get itself established iconographically. Next, please. So there is a flurry of iconology, and very potent iconology, right after the iconoclast controversy, right after Nicaea II. But it's not in conciliar imagery. It's in imagery validating icons, if you see the difference. In other words, the dogma, the theology of the council is being put to work here, right, and being put to work very effectively. Also, the rhetoric of the council is being put to work here. Remember, this is the council that spent the entire sixth session reading paragraph by paragraph through the horos of the iconoclast council, and stopping after every paragraph to utter invective and insult and get the rhetoric level as high as possible. You know, the dogs see the dogs returning to their vomit and that kind of stuff. And that rhetorical element is, of course, here too. But the main point is the theological one. This is text and gloss, of course. This is one of the three marginal psalters. This is text and gloss because the text is this psalm, right? But the literal text of the psalm is being glossed or exegeted as the crucifixion, right? But then the crucifixion is being compared to the iconoclasts.
Could you move the lectern slightly on this side?
Right, and what you see is an iconoclast whitewashing. What is a figura of the clipiated pantocrator that hung over the Chalky Gate, which was one of the great talismans of Constantinople. And so to pick that as the one that's being whitewashed really makes the point. There's been some debate about whether this guy, you notice his figura has unruly hair, has wild hair. It's not neat. Bishops are combed, right? And so some people hypothesize that that's John the Grammarian, but who knows? Next, please. Finally, notice it takes a couple of centuries. Finally, we start to get images of the council itself as councils. And this one's fairly archetypal, but already it has an iconological surprise. When we see the later recension of Nicaea II, the emperors are always Constantine and his mother Irene. Well, no Irene here. Why? Because this is a book which is being presented to one of the most potent emperors. It's a presentation copy, and I think it's trying to emphasize the qualities of masculine empire and provide him with a figura of a predecessor of his who did very good things for the church. One could say a whole lot about this icon. This manuscript illustration, it's an icon. Icon just means image, that's all it means. It doesn't mean anything else but image. Any picture used for religious purposes that teaches religious things is an icon. But we won't stop at this point to say more. It'll come out later in point 5. We talked about position. Here's your heresiarch, not named in this case. So he just sort of sums up all the iconoclasts in one figura. Okay, next please. Notice it's fairly simple. Here's a much later one, and you notice that we get both Constantine and this time as a young boy. The physiognomy is of a young boy, and Irene, and a much fuller presentation of the council, but basically it's the same story. But again, you see that iconographic freedom. Got a new attribute here. They are holding an icon, right? So they're carrying an icon, and they're also holding a scroll which has the anathema on it, right? The anathema that's read on the Triumph of Orthodoxy Vespers. There's always a couple of Roman soldiers accompanying the emperor. That's an attribute, because he's the civil military power. Next, please. Until finally, the iconology has developed to the point where we get really deep originality. This is a very profound icon. It is the first panel icon of the subject of the of Nicaea II. And look at the date. It's the first. It's also the last Byzantine. There's only this one in all of Byzantium. Right? And as a composition, it's absolutely unique, and it's really quite fascinating. Time does not permit me to go through the cast of characters in detail. It's quite an interesting cast of characters. We could spend half an hour on this painting quite easily. Suffice it to say that it is a synaxis. It's a synaxis of heroes of the struggle with the iconoclasts. So the synaxis is, in this case, a kind of reflection on history. It is not only bishops, it includes all kinds of people. It even includes women, right? It includes royal women. It does include some bishops, some monks, right? And you notice some of them are holding icons. Those are ones whose hagiography says they were famous defenders of an icon and got persecuted for it and so on. But the use of registers and the central axis is quite fascinating, because the synaxis is down here, right? Then up here we have the leaders. These are the ones who get named. These just get simple names. These, as you see, get names which give them epithets of being holy, being pious, and so on. And in the very center is this large icon on an altar. So that's the point of it. That's the gloss is put in the very center, in the top register, to hold the whole thing together. Everything else surrounds it, right? This icon is the one that was carried in procession on the day of the Triumph of Orthodoxy, and it has been suggested that you can even recognize the singers who had the right to carry it. Next, please. All right. And now comes the real point. All right, we have said that iconography of councils seems to be highly specific, very purpose-driven. So you'll find it in certain times, certain places, certain circumstances, to certain ends, right? Responding to a felt need. But it's not a kind of universal iconography that's just gone everywhere in Orthodoxy and you find it everywhere. We have said that councils are responsible for icons being universal in Orthodoxy, indispensable. No icons, no Orthodoxy. That's the Second Nicene Council. Later, people would start to say the Second Nicene Council is the Council of Councils. It's the one that sums them all up. Why is that so? Because it's about incarnation. Its underlying theology is the defense of the incarnation. And therefore, in it is summed up all the preceding 6 councils. I would agree with that, but of course that's how I earn my bread and butter too. But if we turn it around, as a consequence, certainly of the theology of the Seventh Council, but actually it's a theology that goes straight back to Scripture itself, in which the word image, icon, is one of the commonest words throughout both Old and New Testament, but especially in the New Testament, is the word that is most used to try to explain the relationship of man with God. There would be 2 basic words. One would be love, the other love and mercy, and the other would be image. Right? And therefore, next slide, any icon is a conciliar icon. Because it's the councils that define the doctrines and the theology which make iconography possible. And that's why we've developed a habit, for example, of putting these 2 icons beside the holy doors, because just by reading those 2 icons you can elicit the dogmas of all the 6 ecumenical councils. And then by being icons, they represent the dogma of the 7th ecumenical council. So all conciliar theology is just in those 2 icons alone. And then you put the whole glossing expansion of that theology all over the place, and you're off to the races. You become a theologian. And therefore you know how to pray. Next, please. All right, now we come to the big stuff. And here, I think I would say that Sister Vasa and I probably stand very much on the same page. Father Taft was, of course, 100% right in the first panel when he said you can't do without history, you have to historicize, you have to understand things in their context. This is even a fundamental, I think, spiritual or theological principle. There is no such thing as the gospel, except just the name Jesus Christ. But if you start to talk about the world mediated by meaning, that hermeneutic world I was speaking of this morning, then there is no gospel outside of culture. Right? And so we have to be historians. And in fact, when people ask me what I do, I just tell them I'm just a simple historian. That's all I am. Nevertheless, if we are looking for what this has to do with pastoralia, with being Christians in our world, we have to turn it around. Right? What we have to do is say, all this historical iconological analysis that we're able to do helps us to read and evoke, what the icons are saying to us. But what it means often requires the kind of reinterpretation that was the heart of Sister Vasa's paper this morning. So that's what we're going to talk about for the rest of the paper. Right, so here's the A point. I'm going to repeat every one of these with every time we come to a new point, just so you see the whole pattern. Right, so first we're going to look at some that say the church is conciliar. The fact of council iconography, right, and its importance where it is used, means we have to think of the church not only in some kind of top-down terms, but also always in conciliar terms, right? The not is not an exclusive not. It's not an either or. It is rather that you can't do without this first clause. Right? Church, right, as the body of Christ. How are you going to show the body of Christ? There are only two ways. One is that pantocrator icon. You show Christ himself. Christ is Christ. That is the church. Right? The church is Christ present. But if you're going to show the church as Christ present, you have to show a synaxis. And that means that a church is definitely horizontal as well as vertical. And that's why meetings like this are super important, by the way. Okay? So let's look at some examples. Next, please. Apostolicity, one of our cardinal dogmas. The church is apostolic. It's in the creed. Right? Well, to make that clear, you're going to show the apostles in a group. You might have thought that the apostles at the ascension were there because that's history. That's what the story literally says. The apostles were there at the ascension. But with something like this, you can't mistake the fact that they're trying to create a synaxis which says apostolicity. So the way they're doing it is to insist on 12 figures. This one does it in a unique and very interesting way, because normally the 12th figure is filled in by Paul, and you usually get a Peter-Paul pairing, but not here. Here they follow much more closely the scriptural text, and so they include Matthias. And we know this is so, because this is all in the inscription, right? So this is probably a festal icon for the feast day. It's quite unusual. There's nothing else quite like it, although the form, the figura, the disposition is typical. Next, please. This one in some ways makes my point more subtly. This is unmistakably an icon of St. Sabas of Kripets. Why is it unmistakably an icon of St. Sabas of Kripets? Because the Vita part is him. That's his story. So he's the subject of the icon. Nonetheless, when you show him, the choice here was to create the hieratic saintliness, not the way the Nicholas icon did, by presenting one main figure all by himself, but by presenting a synaxis. Right? The church is the incarnation, so we get a group of saints, and you'll notice it's a synaxis that crosses time and place. So the company he's keeping is the church throughout the world and throughout time. All right, next please. This one is particularly interesting because it makes us delve very deep into how you have to read this stuff exegetically. Right? So this is one of the 17 illustrated manuscripts of the liturgical, the 16 liturgical homilies of Gregory Nazianzus. Rather interestingly, where this conciliar image occurs almost invariably is as a headpiece for the 14th homily. Why? Because that's the farewell address, the one that he read at the Council of Constantinople, the First Council of Constantinople, and I'll be referring to some of its themes momentarily. But right off the bat, you can see how much taxis and order there is in this picture. Well, remember that one of the very big themes of that particular oration is there's too much dissension out here. You've got to bring things into order. That's why I'm quitting. I'm the cause of the dissension. Right? So maybe if I leave, you'll behave like Christians and come to order. So the iconography partly says that. But this particular homily, this oration, is read on the feast day of Gregory Nazianzus. It's quite a feat to read it, by the way. I did it just to see what it was like. It took 3 hours. Right. The Nicene Post-Nicene Fathers editor says, because he doesn't understand rhetoric, that Gregory read this in the quavering, feeble voice of an aged man, which Gregory himself says. This is, of course, a topos of humility. But when I saw that in the introduction to the NPNF edition, I said, very clearly this man has never, ever met either Father Robert or His Eminence. Where are these quavering old men? God grant me strength, especially for the next 20 minutes. But now for the deep layer of taxes and order. So far, so good. Looks like one of those council pictures, doesn't it? Central figure, right? Flankers, balance, order. Look, you start to look in detail. 3 people are seated. 3 people are seated. This is the Old Testament Trinity. This is the figura of the Old Testament Trinity. So Gregory's own doctrines are brought into the icon. The central part of the oration is him summing up his doctrine. He says, since I'm leaving now, you'll never hear me again. I better remind you what I taught you. And another nice topos. And he goes through the whole Cappadocian Trinitarian doctrine, point by point. Right? Well, there it is iconologically. Whoever did this has read this oration very, very well. Okay? There is a total of 1 liter. Hello. Here it is. Total of 1 liter and 16, 8 and 8. That's the number of the prophets. Right? The leader, of course, is Jesus Christ, to whom all prophecy points. And as I said in the initial Iconology 101, all bishops are Christ. Figuratively speaking, too. You can see it. And what has he got as attributes? Right? A book. But then, if you take away the 2 seated guys, you have 7 and 7. I don't have to explain 7 to this audience. But I will remind you that 7 plus 7 makes 14. And don't know how often you've read the prologue to Matthew, but you might want to think about 14s. Next, please. All right, the B point. All right, so given this conciliar fact, sobornos, conciliarity, that's what we've been talking about, nevertheless, there is always recognizable authority. We are coming around to His Eminence's Emperor, right? And I'm going to give him an argument in his favor, and then at the end I will tear it down. Next, please. Here's one of the very, very early examples. This is a presentation volume. It's one of the most sumptuous volumes ever created in Byzantium. And it is unusually not the liturgical homilies, it is all of the homilies. Even more unusually, this image is not an image for the farewell address. It's the frontispiece to the 34th oration, which is the one where he praises the visiting Egyptians for going to the Orthodox Church instead of going to the Arian Church. And we see this kind almost balance of authorities because we see the emperor here and ecclesiastics here. So what occupies then the center, the position of leadership, the hetomasia, the prepared throne? So Christ is at the center. When I was thinking about giving this, I thought very hard about Metropolitan Callistos' suggestion that there are apophatic symbols, the ark being a good one, and I thought, is this one? Because there's no figure of Christ here. And this, of course, way after the Council of Trullo said, always got to present Christ, no symbolic representations. But this one goes back to early times and carries right on through. And I thought, no, this is a rhetorical synecdoche. These are attributes of Christ to present Christ. That is, it's Christ as the Word, Christ as the cross, right? Enthroned. So that's the leadership here. Nevertheless, it's still for the emperor. You notice only the emperor has a halo. So there's that little sort of competition for leadership. Next, please. And here I give you the 2 extremes. Here's a very simple conciliar image for homily 14. Just Gregory and four bishops. Why 4? Because there are 4 gospels. Here is the one from Dechani that we looked at before, and you see that very, very clearly the emperor is presented as the ruler, president of the council, and as the authority. And this is where the gospel and culture point comes in. Why are all these pictures in the Balkans? Why are they're all in emerging empires and kingdoms? And in fact, in Serbia, where the bulk of them are, you just run off the list: Ohrid, Sopčani, this one, on and on and on, Aurelia. You never see the conciliar series without also seeing the family tree of the Nemanja. And as we saw, you often see the local Serbian councils as well. So it's a reinforcement of local royal authority. They emphasize the emperor as the president of the council. Although, as Metropolitan Callistus' paper on Florence suggested, sometimes maybe this is a good thing when you have warring bishops. Next, please. Here's an attempt to combine these two authorities. It's a very curious and a unique picture in another one of the homilies, in which the conciliar picture has Gregory at the center, alone, no emperor in sight. But in the upper register, Gregory, as simple abbot, is receiving his authority from the emperor, who is the one elevated on the shield. So it's trying very hard to balance these things, kind of the way in the West was an equal attempt to balance the civil authority of the emperor from the ecclesiastical authority of the Pope. So you'll notice that as time goes on, there is kind of less and less and less willingness, except in those Balkan regions, which really need images of rulership, to let the emperor run the show. Next, please. All right, the C point. Right? Now, this needs some explaining. One of the deep meanings that we're going to get out of council iconography is the notion that the order of God's kingdom, the order that is our ultimate destiny, the order that is the goal of life, right, needs to be present now. The Orthodox notion of eschatology is not future eschatology, right? We aren't some sort of Protestant evangelicals waiting to be raptured up. We are living in the kingdom now. We are icons of it. And so whatever is true ultimately of Christ is also true of Christ now. And the reason why all the prophets point to Christ is that that was always so. Right? So it's a reminder to be orderly, right? Like Gregory's homily. Next, please. Let's look at some examples of this. This one illustrates that eschatological point extremely well. It's another one of the liturgical homilies. It's the 14th homily. There's Gregory at the center with the monks arranged around him. If you look at the figura, I think practically everyone here could instantly spot the basic design of a Pentecost icon. This is in the figural form of a Pentecost icon, and just to reinforce it, this is the initial tau of the homily, and it's the same thing. Gregory, this time with 10 bishops, right, instead of 8. Notice the numbers, by the way. 8, perfect number. 10, number of the 10 Commandments. And just even the marginal gloss says, be orderly. Next, please. That point can be made especially if we look at two images from the same manuscript. So this is the image for the 14th homily, and you can see the taxis, the order in it that we've been talking about. Whereas there's another subject matter, it's called Gregory teaching, for another of the homilies, quite common, and you see how teaching is a narrative activity. Teaching is dynamic, it's very, very narrative, right? Same manuscript, they know what they're doing. Next, please. Even in the period which the Russians love to loathe, when Orthodox iconography becomes so thoroughly westernized, even there this sense of ordo and taxis is still fundamental to an image of a council, even if the figure is Western. So the figura here of a meeting, this is a unique painting. The figure is borrowed from Western pictures of parliaments, especially British paintings of parliaments. Right? So there's certainly no literal historiography about this. We still have the central symbols placed in the midst of the bishops. They actually did put these prepared thrones, starting, I think, from Chalcedon or Ephesus on. They quite regularly created these prepared thrones and actually set them up right in the middle of the council meeting. Next, please. For those of you who don't know who Ushakov is, he's sort of the iconography answer to Peter Mohila. He is to iconography what Peter Mohila is to Orthodox teaching and methodology. Council iconography tells us that there is such a thing as heresy, right? And one of the functions of having that sense of order is to make this clear, and therefore to show that heresy must be put in its place. It must submit, right? But the reason this is shown in council is that it's about the mind of the church, and this is subtly leading to my definitive next point. It's about the mind of the church. It's not just about a bunch of rules that a certain council laid down, right? And we can see this both literally and metaphorically. Next, please. So literally, we see, as we've shown, that the standard place for the heretic is here. There are some other presentations, we will see them. Heretics at the margins. They can't get to the center. Heretics with their backs turned on the center. So there are some other presentations. There are attributes for heretics. Their books are closed. Their books are being dropped. Sometimes their books are being burnt, right? As opposed to the books of truth, which are attributes of real bishops. Next, please. This dogmatic aspect of councils is so important that one of the strangest iconographic programs of all is the one in the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, where we don't even get any figural presentations other than the framework, the architectural framework and the altar. So there are attributes that are figurae, but the council itself is represented only by inscriptions. And the inscriptions tell you they tell you who was there, how many bishops, when it was held, what the key dogma of the council was, and who the heretic was that got anathematized. Also very interesting is that the south wall, you can just sort of see the arrangement here. You get fathers of the church in the lowest register, the councils in the middle register, and mostly destroyed angels above. Those are the 7 ecumenical councils. Next, please. But on the north wall are 6 local councils, right? Up to the end of the 4th century. All the well-known ones. And I consulted with the student I spoke of yesterday who wrote the thesis under Andrew Louth. And according to him, what this represents then is a canonical collection. These are the standard elements of collected canon books, but the order of these local councils does vary, and he found this order extremely interesting, and he's going to explore it. I don't know why they're in the order that they're in. Next, please. Or if you want to say, this is the Catholic faith, and he who wishes to be saved, right? He who wishes to be saved must recite this creed. You show the church as a circular, perfect-shaped synaxis, a council. Next, please. And, of course, the in malo, the opposite possibility is also there. You can have a disorderly council of the impious. And we all know this, right? It's from Great Vespers. Do not sit, Psalm 1, do not sit in the council of the impious. But actually that's a phrase that's repeated often in the Psalter, and there's a lot of iconography connected with it. You can see it here. Next, please. But this is perhaps the most unique and interesting example of all. This is what I'm calling metaphorical. So the icon is an icon of the 7 pillars of wisdom, of the Book of Wisdom. And so you see wisdom has built herself a house with 7 pillars. And it's a church, of course. But then who's sitting on each pillar is one of the 7 ecumenical councils. So the number 7 was recognized to be typological for the number of councils, and therefore this unique image was constructed. By the way, the definitive paper on this was done by a very young whippersnapper student in Paris at Saint-Serge, who was just starting to get his chops. His name was John Meyendorff. Next, please. And so now we come to what I regard as the big point. That if we try to get our heads around what we've accomplished so far, what we've seen, learned from all this conciliar iconography, we realize that, and I think this is what we've been hearing throughout the conference from everybody, but we heard it especially well this morning, and that is that authoritative recognition is a process, right? That reception is vital, right? That Orthodox tradition is not a set of aperçus, of obiter dicta, of council regulations, of holy canons, of whatever. It's about the dialogue between life and all of that. The dialogue. And I mean dialogue too, when I talk about reception. That's the sense, I spoke of it in this morning's panel, about the difference between being historical but not being historicist, right? We expect, therefore, the subject of this conference, today's conference, to be forever. Ongoing, dialogical, hermeneutic, right? Councils do not just juridically regulate our lives, right? Reception is essential. And the result of this is that any one council equals all councils, past and future. The councils themselves acknowledge this. The first thing any council says, usually in Canon 1, is we receive, right, what the 150 fathers said and what the 330 fathers said, and so on and so on and so on. And then they repeat the creed. Next, please. So I'll show you just a couple of examples of this in conciliar iconography, and here's where the subtlety comes in. So here's another Gregory homilies. And notice that here, instead of the blessing gesture, that the figura is the bishop's figura of the Pantocrator, but what Christ in the Pantocrator is doing is blessing with his name. But here, it's a speaking gesture. And all his fellow bishops are responding. The dialogue is ongoing, you see. It's part of the essence of conciliar iconography. Next, please. That's made especially clear in this other manuscript, where I'm giving you 2 scenes from the same manuscript. We've already spoken of the Pentecost nature of the figure or the form of conciliar iconography. But this one's very striking. Notice this. So here are the apostles sitting around, Peter, Paul, and the pair. But there's 2 people in here. And they're in dialogue. This is unique to this particular recension, this Gregory recension. It's found in several of these manuscripts. Next, please. This is your standard image, with Cosmos in that position, hieratic, frontal, but in the lower zone, subordinate, right? The world, in short, receives the word of the apostles. So he's carrying a cloth with 12 scrolls in it, which is the words of the apostle. Compare that to this, which says absolutely dialogue is going on. By the way, you notice that one has a crown and one has sort of vestments. Next, please. Even in this example that we saw before, we have the Orthodox and who get polystoria vestments. I hope you notice that everybody here has been wearing 14th century clothing, no matter what the subject matter is. And the heretics, and they're jabbering away, although the heretics turn their backs. Their figura is presented as I'm not really in dialogue here. My back is turned to you. Right? That's not how dialogue works. Next, please. Then there is the idea that all councils are one council, so that's why you get these series. The whole thing together represents the Orthodox faith as we have received it. Notice, by the way, that this also mingles local councils. Come on. Well, local councils with the ecumenical councils. And then the Nemanja family tree is right over there. Next, please. This is the most unique example and one that really proves the point, I think. I was hoping, I had the privilege of photographing this manuscript myself, and I was hoping to be able to show you a gorgeous color picture of this. And as we were going through the manuscript, great photograph after great photograph. But of course, that's where the image is, and of course they're not going to let you do this. This was done 40 years ago when you still could do that, right? Not today. So anyway, that's what it looks like in situ, right? This extraordinary 12th century, late 11th, 12th century lectionary in the Morgan Library. But the point is, this is the initial T, right, for the First Council of Nicaea, right, for the commemoration of the First Council of Nicaea. And you see it's reduced to heads, rather than with the halos making clipia, which are marks of honor. So the halos kind of do a double function there of being both a frame and a halo. But the physiognomies let us identify the people, and they're all the great fathers of the church. They're not the fathers of Nicaea. So we can recognize John Chrysostom in there. We can recognize Basil in there. So it's not historical. It's an ecclesiological statement that what a council accomplishes is for the whole church, and not just a historical moment of that council. Next, please. Right? Or you can do it the other way by synecdoche. So here's the great Meteora, and on the east wall, you notice, put where you can see it above the iconostasis, is Pentecost. So Pentecost as the foundation of all conciliarity. But then out in the narthex, right, you have various scenes in the life of Christ, and just on one side you have Nicaea 1, and in the other corner Nicaea 2. That's all. Instead of the whole series. It's like those two councils can sum up the whole in the fashion of a synecdoche. It's quite wonderful. Next, please. And so we come to the last point, and so at this point I do a proskinesis in front of His Eminence and say, forgive me, but if we're going to do this reception, this exegesis, this interpretation of what all that we've learned from iconography is going to mean for us in our praxis today, we learn both very good things but also very problematical things from all this image of the emperor as the authority at a council. And it's very clear. One thing that we learn is that lay society has to be there. That's a good thing. That's really important to learn. One of the harder things to cope with is that overwhelmingly we have seen the synaxis or conciliarity as clergy. In fact, only higher clergy at that. A whole lot of bishops. And our notion of a great and holy council is a whole bunch of bishops getting together. Well, the imagery would suggest part of reception is going to happen in the world. Right? You know, by the world. The church is the whole body of Christ, and we can't take this up now, but it's a well-recognized principle. It's been discussed by pan-Orthodox conferences in Europe and all kinds of, that you can't have a church without the laity and the clergy. But therefore, we're in the 21st century. Who's the emperor? And where are we going to identify the figure of the emperor? Next, please. Right? So I'll show you this manuscript from Vercelli. It's a canon law collection, right? And you can see how utterly prominent the role of the emperor is, right? Only one with a halo here, right? Compared to Peter and Paul there. Next, please. On the next page, right? The whole opening is given to this council, and the emperor fills the whole page, right? Even hard to tell that these guys are bishops. Next, please. The relation of one council to another, by the way, is shown by the fact that the explanation of this image is on the preceding page with the preceding council. So they see it as a tied together series, right? But look at this. It ends with Christ enthroned as a parallel figure, not to a bishop this time, but to the emperor. So that imperial aspect of it is really, really, really significant. Exegetically speaking, I think we'd have to recognize it as representing, the lay world, as a voice in church decision making. Next, please. Right. One last example where he's telling off all these holy bishops. And so we'll end with this final example, which I think should have been the icon of the conference. Right? Why should it be the icon of of Lumen Orientale in particular? Well, first of all, there's an emperor. Well, we all know who that is. That's Jack Fiegel. But now we come to an exegetical problem. You see this? That's a beehive triple tiara. If it is, as it's intended to be, an image of the First Ecumenical Council, right, that would be the Pope. Now, at the U.S. versions of this conference, Father Bear gave a paper in which he pointed out that no Pope ever attended an Ecumenical Council. Ever. Right? Sent legates. Always. So, are we going to take this as an attribute, that is to say, it just represents papal authority? Or are we going to say this is the rewriting of history by a painter who was kind of caught halfway between East and West? And we don't know for whom this was painted. It's one of a series of 6 very important, they're very large icons, and don't know quite for whom they were intended. They're still in Crete now. Right? And besides, we have so many candidates for who this person could be to the Lumen Orientale conference. I suppose the hierarchical sense, the top-down sense, would say would have to be His Eminence. But we also have Father Taft, and maybe it's Sister Vasa. You will note that he has included. You will note that he has included the Hetimasia. That's still there, and this up here is the vision of Peter of Alexandria about the church. This is about order in the church. You see how orderly it is, and it's a church torn by. The vision shows Christ with his robe torn, right? And that's included in here. We saw it in a couple of previous icons. Yes.
What did you say that is between the Pope and
the prepared throne, the same thing I showed you, right? But, lest we, in the spirit of Sister Vasa's paper, lest we think that councils lay down the law, the truth, right, forever and all time, and that no act of understanding is necessary to figure out what they want us to do, right? In this very same series, next please, is this painting. And I'm certain you have all been part of the kinds of discussions Sister Vasa spoke of, where know-it-all people say this is not an Orthodox image, and if you do this, you are westernizing, and it absolutely can't be, and so on and so on. A number of those spiritualizing books on iconology say the same thing, and yet here the two things are: the absolute conciliar authority of the Church, and the absolute popularity, reception of an image like this, right? At Arbanasi, where we've seen the whole series of consoles, what's on the roof over your head is a gigantic Throne of Mercy Trinity, New Testament Trinity. Practically fills the whole ceiling, right? And there was a time before Arbanasi became a museum town when the place was packed with people praying in the Orthodox manner. So you see, it's a process. Life is not simple. Now there is a local canon that's later than this, right? Which says you may, no it isn't later than this. It says you may not do this. It's a local Russian synodal canon, right? Well, this is possibly the commonest iconography in Russia, and people are very devoted to it. So you see, from iconography, perhaps we come even closer to the living reality of what it means to live in a church of councils than we do by the attempt to do abstract systematizing and codifying.